How exciting is this as we get the opportunity to vote for Brian Walters, SC, onto the floor of the House of Government, a new breakthrough, a first time in a mainland Australian state. And as Melbourne has shown just a month or so ago, Melbourne can do it. First of all, I want to tell you about a chance meeting with Brian. He came down to, as a young fellow, just graduating in law, to help do some essential backroom paperwork and support work for the Franklin blockade, in which history shows that Melbourne was the centre of gravity changer, both in its exports to the Franklin blockade and to the great work done by the people of Melbourne. The Franklin flows free to the sea. At the same time, Wild magazine, with Brian and his friends, became established and is now my favourite reading material when it lands in the inbox each edition. Thank you for that, Brian, and your great friends. And then after meeting a few other times along the way, not least in the formation of the Victorian and the Australian Greens, right from day one, I came down, slipped over the border from the ACT after Parliament one night at the behest of Margaret Blakers, also out of the Victorian Greens, to spend a night camping in the East Gippsland forests. And it was fantastic. Got there in the dark, there was a circle of people around a fire. Somebody was strumming a guitar, which I enjoyed for an hour or two, but then I went over the hill to put up my tent and have a sleep. And I woke up in the morning, one of those transcendental natural mornings with the mist out. The lyrebirds were mimicking the other birds with their real song. It was just a fabulous spring morning experience in the Victorian forests. I gathered my gear together to come and join the friends because we were moving on to Melbourne that day. And there was a couple of gentlemen in blue standing at the fire on this occasion, and one of them immediately said to me, "Are you moving out?" And I said, "No, not yet, I like it here." Well, I next thing found myself in a paddy wagon on the way to Orbost. This was Goolengook. And in Orbost, amongst other things, the clerk of the Senate rang to let the good police officers know that if a member of the Senate is arrested, they must inform the President straight off. Not that she did anything in particular to help me in that situation. But the long and the short of it is that Brian became my advocate in that case, as Adam has averred to, and through a series of court hearings and a wonderful night or two out up on the Bulbor Plateau or range in springtime again, with Brian's family and our friends, the court found two things. Firstly, that the logging under the Kennett government at Goolengook was illegal. And secondly, by direct inference, I'm putting words into the good judge's mouth, those of us who were out camped blocking the bulldozers were upholding the law on behalf of the government, which was breaking it. Thank you, Brian. More recently, I've been with Brian at a number of very telling public meetings in Melbourne for human rights, for the right of people seeking freedom and peace in this place, fleeing from desperate circumstances overseas to be treated as warm-blooded human beings with their international rights upheld. For people who are in the Indigenous community and have not had their rights recognised, let alone upheld. For people generally who are, because of their financial circumstances, don't have the access to courts of many of the rest of us. Unflaggingly, there is, from Brian Walters' advocacy in public life, as well as at the bar, a humanity and a recognition of the rights of all citizens to be equal before the law, which is constant, which is wise, which very importantly is heartfelt, and which Brian Walters will carry into a parliament where it's very badly needed. I called Brian when we were looking at the government's carbon trading scheme, federally, the CPRS as it's called, last year, to look at the provisions of that Act, which transferred $20 billion from the taxpayers to the polluters to gain a 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when we should be aiming for 40%. $20 billion. And to cut this story short, Brian's advice, which helped bolster the concern proven since to be correct and right by the Greens in opposing that legislation, that if the government were to try to amend in the future that 5% target to a higher target, those same polluters would be able to challenge the government under the Constitution to get billions more out of the pockets of ordinary taxpayers. And we weren't about to sign up to such a scheme, which inherently meant that if you were going to really have a go at addressing dangerous climate change in this country, which is one of the worst per capita polluters on the face of the planet, thanks largely to the coal industry and the destruction of forests, then the penalty would be a massive impost on the average power consumer and citizen in Australia. Not a peep out of the coalition, the Liberals or the Nationals, about that great big tax which was built into that legislation. Well now, because people in Melbourne decided to vote to make history, we have Adam Bandt, the first Greens elected at a general election on the floor of the National Parliament, able to advocate for social justice, for peace, for democracy, and understrapping it all, this fragile mantle of life on this planet upon which we all depend and which is being destroyed again tonight as we sit here at the greatest rate in human history, with Australia not backward in contributing to that devastating outcome. Adam's advent in the Parliament, along with 4 new senators, which will give the Greens the touted balance of power, which we will use responsibly as we've done in the past with balance of power, in the upper house of the National Parliament, has brought a great dividend to people who voted Green at the national elections. And whatever you read in the newspapers, everywhere I'm going around Australia at the moment, people are coming up and saying, isn't this exciting? Isn't this great? The big parties don't dominate anymore. We're hearing about other issues there's a debate on. We don't know the outcome. This is how democracy should be. But we have eloquent, strong, ethically and inherently committed candidates now in both houses of the National Parliament, thanks to the voters of Melbourne. Well, come last Saturday in November, Melbourne can make double history, because not only will Melbourne have placed crucial members into both houses of the National Parliament, it will have done the same in both houses of the Parliament of Victoria. That's why we are here this time on voting Green. If you get asked why, say, well, besides Brian Walters in Melbourne, it's because last time I voted Green. And look what happened. We are on are in this to give people who've been disenfranchised for decades power in the parliaments. We are in this to represent those who are coming after us, our children and our grandchildren, on the floor of parliaments in everything we do, so that we don't only disenfranchise them, but we don't leave them struggling to wonder how decent, intelligent people back in 2010 could not have risen to give parliaments a better moral, ethical and environmental compass than what we see in Spring Street and what we've seen in the national parliaments in the years leading up to now. This is a most exciting moment for Melbourne, and Brian Walters is not going to be just somebody else in the state parliament, in the House of Government. Brian will take it up to them. You've just heard him speak. He knows what he's talking about. He has an intelligence and a grasp of the issues and their interrelatedness, which is so badly needed to tackle the next government in the Victorian Parliament, be it Labor or be it a coalition government in the Victorian Parliament. There cannot be a better dividend than putting Brian Walters in with that mob to bring intelligence, far-sightedness, responsibility and a cohesive new ethic onto the floor of a parliament which has been needing it so much for so many decades now. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the coming, well, I just diverted for one moment. I heard Brian talking about not enough money to pay for brochures in every letterbox or to everybody in Melbourne. There's just a few weeks left. People do count, and we have great people commitment. But unfortunately, the reality about the way our society works in a world in which there isn't public funding alone, but there is massive fundraising by the big parties, by vested interests. The Greens depend on ordinary people to make donations to make the campaign work. And we know from experience here in Melbourne that if you don't have that campaign wherewithal, you can have the best ideas in the world, but they'll outdo us in the last week. Please dig deep. Please write a cheque. I commit myself to writing a bigger cheque than I ever had for a state election campaign before, for Brian and his great colleagues in the adjacent seats and the candidates for both houses to give us the strongest Green representation on the floors of the Victorian Parliament we've ever had. Ladies and gentlemen, ask your friends to donate. Tell them you are voting Green in case they haven't run into somebody who's got such foresight, intelligence and power of conviction in recent times. But most of all, in the coming weeks, do what you can to get behind this campaign to make sure we're not drowned out by the big parties in the run for the ballot box. Brian, this is, for you and your colleagues, this is a launch of a wonderful campaign. I'm looking forward to coming to Melbourne as much as I can in the coming weeks because it's just so exciting to be here in a campaign that has such a wonderful campaign candidate, that has such great campaigners, that's already shown that it can elect great candidates into great Houses of Parliament. We want to do it again. We've just done it. Melbourne can just do it again. Ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you all for having such a wonderful candidate. Brian, I wish you well. And on that last Saturday in November, Melbourne, let's make history again.